Good evening. This is Rotary E Club of District 7710, Tuesday, April the 2nd. Good evening. This is Rotary E Club of District 7710. This is Tuesday, April the 2nd, and we're very glad to have you all here this evening. We'd like to introduce our program, and we'll have Kevin Primus introduce our speaker tonight.
Good evening, this is Kevin Primus, and I want to introduce you tonight to Nikki Bhenke, who is an MSPH student in the Environmental Sciences and Engineering Department at UNC's Gilling School of Global Public Health. She graduated from UNC with a bachelor's in Peace, War, and Defense in Political Science in 2016 and worked in global water advocacy in Washington, D.C. prior to returning to UNC for her master's degree. She has worked with the Water Institute at UNC since 2015 on projects related to sustainable water, sanitation, and hygiene, also known as WASH, services in rural communities, and healthcare facilities in sub-Saharan Africa. Her current research is focused on environmental health of forcibly displaced populations. She spent the summer of 2018 in Jordan conducting research on the sustainability of WASH and waste management services in Azraq Refugee Camp, and we named our third daughter after her. So Nikki, if you would, if everyone can mute their microphones except Nikki, that would be great. And Nikki, thank you for being with us tonight.
Great, thanks for having me. Just if no one can hear me, just give me a shout because now my entire screen is full of my slides. Can everyone see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll get started then. As Kevin said, my name is Nikki Bhenke. I am a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill in Gilling School of Global Public Health. I've been working with the Water Institute, which is a research institute focused on global water, sanitation, and hygiene since I was a junior in college. And then I went away for a little while after graduating and then couldn't stay away from Chapel Hill. So I came back after about a year to pursue an MSPH. And I'm actually approaching graduation in 6 weeks now, so it's gone by really, really quickly. Today, I'm going to be talking to you all about environmental health in protracted displacement, and I'll define that in a little bit. And it's a case study of Azraq Refugee Camp in Jordan. And this is part of my master's thesis, which I defended about a month ago. So just to kind of give you some definitions right off the bat, so that you know who we're talking about when I say forcibly displaced populations. So around the world, there are more than 68 million people who have been forcibly displaced. And by forcible displacement, what I mean is having been displaced as a result of human or man-made disaster, or human or natural disaster. So this does not necessarily include people who have been displaced due to economic reasons or who are voluntarily moving. Of the 68 million people who have been displaced, which is approaching 1% of the human population, about 25 million are refugees, but most of them are internally displaced persons, which is essentially a refugee within one's own borders. And then among refugees, about a fifth are Palestinian refugees. So UNHCR is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they are responsible for most refugees. And then UNRWA is actually a really long acronym. It's the UN Work Relief and Works Agency for Near East Palestine Refugees. And so they are responsible for providing for those 5.4 million people. And then there are 3.1 million asylum seekers who are essentially waiting to become officially a refugee. And then as of 2017, to give you an idea of how quickly this population is growing, this growth rate was equivalent to nearly 45,000 new people being displaced every day, which is a huge number to wrap your mind around. And then an important thing in the public health world is thinking about the impact on children. And so 52% of displaced persons are under the age of 18. So there's a pretty common misconception that displaced persons all live in camps, and that's actually not the case. So about 60% of refugees are living in urban areas. So they're living in slums or informal settlements or with families. So more than half are not living in camps. And the vast majority are living in lower and middle income countries. That's what LMIC stands for. And so the top host of refugees are Turkey, Pakistan, Uganda, and Lebanon. Lebanon is a pretty interesting case in particular because they have so many refugees that it's 1 in 6 people in Lebanon is a refugee. And then in terms of IDPs, the highest numbers are in Colombia, Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Iraq.
Hey, Nikki, this
And
is,
so, yes.
we're not seeing your slides advance.
Oh, no. Let me make sure.
Sorry. I know sometimes it's a
It's
little.
okay, thank you. Let me see if I can get it back up.
Yeah, there.
Okay, can you still see them?
Yeah, they're advanced now. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Great, thank you for letting me know. And so protracted crises is in my title, so I should probably explain it. But essentially, a protracted crisis is defined by UNHCR as being a displacement that has lasted longer than 2 years. And that is the norm at this point. When you think about refugee and IDP camps and settlements, they're generally designed to be short-term solutions, or at least thought of that way. But approximately 70% of refugees are in a protracted situation, meaning that they have been there for over 2 years. So that has implications for planning and for public health and for thinking about infrastructure. And then over 80% of refugee crises last more than 10 years. So it's going way beyond that 2-year mark. And some are even lasting into 20 years. So what should be expected at this point is when there's a refugee or IDP crisis, it's very common that it will last more than 2 years. And that's significant because protracted crises require different environmental health conditions and guidelines and infrastructures than emergencies do. So I mentioned the SPHERE standards on this slide, which are the humanitarian handbook for responding to emergencies. And they also have some provisions for protracted crises. So an example of something that might be different between the two is in emergencies, the SPHERE standards say that water bottles are an acceptable form of water supply, but that isn't a sustainable method for the long term. So when you're looking at a protracted crisis, you really need to be investing in longer term infrastructure. So diving into the research specifically, so as many of you know, the Sustainable Development Goals were passed in 2015, and SDG 6 is known as the WASH goal. It's to ensure availability and sustainable management of all water and sanitation for all. And that for all is really what got the Water Institute originally interested in this topic. So this particular study that I'm going to talk about is part of a larger set of research that the Water Institute's doing on involuntarily displaced populations. So that includes anywhere where someone is spending a significant portion of their life, not entirely of their own volition. So that includes prisoners, people living in homeless shelters, in orphanages, and also in refugee and IDP settings. So inadequate environmental health services, and I'll get into what that means in a second, we know that they have detrimental impacts on human health, development, and well-being, and we know that in these settings, they tend to be they tend to be inadequate. And part of the reason for that is that SDGs are really reliant upon national governments to achieve the different standards and goals that it sets. And these populations, particularly refugees and IDPs, don't necessarily fall under a clear authority in terms of a national government because they've either left their country or they're in a country where the government has failed in some way. Which is what drew us to this topic in particular, was to make sure that they are not left out of the Sustainable Development Goals just because they don't have a clear national authority. And then evidence on public health in these settings is of varying quality. That's a kind of diplomatic way of saying that there isn't very much of it, and a lot of it is not very good. And so we wanted to see if we could fill that gap. And we did this through a set of what are called systematic literature reviews. I'm not going to go into those too much, but essentially we pulled together all of the literature that was available on environmental health in these settings and then did a meta-analysis, or not a meta-analysis. That's a very technical term that I'm not supposed to use in this setting. But we analyzed all of the data to see what some of the common threads were. And one more point on this slide, when I say environmental health, that goes beyond water, sanitation, and hygiene, or WASH, because environmental health is a lot larger than that, and WASH is connected to a lot of other things that are often left out of academic research. So this can include everything from waste management to energy supply, because energy supply is often required to pump water, and to vector control, and a bunch of other topics that are often kind of neglected when people are doing WASH research. So getting into this study in particular,
Nikki,
yes?
sorry, your slides are still not advancing. I'm really sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. Here, let me see.
Yeah, I don't know.
Really.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. It looked like they were going to advance. Maybe you have to click through every single, I don't know how to tell you.
This isn't the prettiest, but can you see it as it is now?
It says families fleeing violence.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just going to click through this. Did it change just now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll do it this way. Not the prettiest way, but that's okay. And so the Syrian refugee crisis is the largest refugee crisis since World War II. It's displaced more than half of the Syrian population, and about 6 million have been displaced internally, and then about 5.6 million have gone across national borders. And so we're going to be talking about Jordan in particular, and this slide says that there's 670,000 Syrian refugees living in Jordan, but that's actually an underestimate probably. That only accounts for registered refugees, and the number is estimated to be closer to 1.3 million. And so to give you a little more context, the Middle East hosts 6% of the world's population, and unsurprisingly only hosts 1% of its water resources. So it's a very water scarce area, very arid climate in a lot of places. And climate change is a threat multiplier in the region, which means that the existing political tensions and economic instability and conflict are likely to be compounded by the impacts of climate change. And this region is particularly vulnerable to climate change because different climate models predict that there will be decreased rainfall and decreased crop yield, and also hotter temperatures, all of which are bad things for a region where 70% of the population is employed through agriculture. And then obviously conflict is prevalent in the region, that's not surprising, and that's led to substantial forced migration. And something that I want to note that's often kind of left out of discussions about migration isn't necessarily a failure. It's often framed as such, especially in the US. But it's actually, in some cases, it can be a very effective means of adapting to things like climate change or conflict. And it's just when it becomes a humanitarian crisis and the institutions aren't in place to support those people that we start to have problems. And then, so talking about Jordan in particular, depending on which think tank you ask, they're either the second or fourth most water scarce country in the world. And they are already using more fresh water than is renewable. That ratio has been way over 1 for a very long time. They also have pretty high unemployment and poverty rates, and they're already hosting over 2 million Palestinian refugees. So they've been known as having a very liberal refugee policy, and they have less liberal policies for Syrian refugees than they did for Palestinian refugees. But that's an important bit of context to have, is that they've already hosted lots of refugees from the Palestinian territories, and in fact, about half of their population is Palestinian. And then 83% of Syrian refugees are living in host communities, especially in the northern governorates. You can kind of see where that is on this map. And in those governorates. That's put pressure on water resources. And there have been reports of decreased water quality, decreased water availability, and in some cases, tensions between host communities and refugees, and one reported case of riots. And then just to tell you about where we're going to be focusing today, there's this arrow right here showing you where Azraq Camp is. It's in the middle of nowhere, which I'll get to in a second. And just to make sure, are my slides advancing now?
Yes, they are.
Great. Okay, so talking about Azraq Refugee Camp. As you can see, it looks more like military barracks than it does your average conception of a refugee camp. It's in the middle of nowhere, pretty much equidistant between Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Syria. It gets to about 110 degrees in the summer, and it just looks like you're on Mars, honestly. Having been there a few times, you look around and you just see this kind of red clay for miles and miles and miles, and lots of dust tornadoes and things like that. So it opened in early 2014, which is 3 years after the Syrian refugee crisis began. And that's because it was built as an overflow camp for the largest refugee camp for Syrians in Jordan, which is called Zaatari. And that one filled up with 80,000 people, reached capacity. So they built this new one. And they essentially tried to build it to incorporate lessons learned from Zaatari. So they tried to correct for some of the mistakes. So it's divided into 4 villages right now. I cannot tell you why there is no village 1 and no village 4, but there's village 2, 3, 5, and 6. It took me about a month to figure out that there was no village 1 or 4. And there are currently about 40,000 people in it, but it could be expanded up to 130,000 people. And then there's no formal employment opportunities in the camp. It's not possible to get a work permit, or it's very difficult to as a Syrian refugee. But refugees can be paid an hourly wage as a temporary incentive-based volunteer, which is shortened as IBVs. And so they usually will work for an NGO and get an hourly wage for either skilled or unskilled labor. Azraq has actually gotten quite a bit of press, most of it glowing. It's been lauded as kind of the ideal refugee camp, how to build a camp from scratch, the fact that it has clean energy, which is true. They do have solar panels and are 70% powered by solar energy. But there's still a lot of access issues, and as we'll talk about, there are a lot of other environmental health issues in the camp. To give you a little more background of the environmental health conditions, there's 2 boreholes in the camp, and they pump water to communal tap stands, and there's 302 of them. And then average daily water distribution is actually relatively high for a refugee camp. It's 41.5 liters per capita. Per day. And then there's sanitation blocks, which you can see an early diagram of here provided by World Vision, who I worked with this summer. And this only has 10 shelters in it, but it's an early diagram, so it's actually, blocks are actually 12 shelters. And so there's wash blocks in these plots, essentially, and on each end you'll have a shower and a latrine. And so one end is for women, one end is for men. And then there's an on-site wastewater treatment plant, which for some reason they airdropped essentially from Afghanistan. Still don't understand that fully, but it doesn't actually work. So it's not serving its purpose anyway. And then there's waste collection and recycling conducted by NGOs 6 days per week. And there have been a few outbreaks of infectious diseases. There's been no cases of cholera, which is often the scariest one in these situations, but there have been cases of scabies and head lice and hepatitis A. Okay, so what did we actually do in Azraq? So over the summer, we did 25 stakeholder interviews in the camp and with people who worked in the camp but were based in Amman. And many of them were with World Vision staff. World Vision was kind of our entry point into the camp. And then we also interviewed individuals from UNHCR, from UNICEF, from Action Against Hunger, and Care International, and I believe I'm forgetting another one. And then we also interviewed a few refugees. They had to be affiliated with an NGO or one of World Vision's partners for us to be able to interview them because of the security environment in the camp. But we were still able to interview a few refugees, which was exciting. So we had some community leaders and some incentive-based volunteers. And this should give you an idea of some of the research questions that we were working with. First had to do with stakeholders that were involved in WASH, and SWM means solid waste management in Azraq. The second is about the coordination and communication between these actors. The third is about how sustainability is addressed and perceived by these actors. And the fourth is how the approach has changed over time. We were also interested in just what people had to say about the environmental health conditions. So for one, as I mentioned, the water quantity per capita is higher than most standards, though it was noted, and there's a quote at the bottom of the slide here, that the water availability had decreased from 24 hours a day to 2 hours a day due to some rationing, and that had been a recent development. They also are they're accustomed to abundant water supplies because Syria is quite a water-rich country, which is interesting because it's often portrayed as a very arid place, and parts of it are. But this was noted several times that Syrian refugees are used to very high service levels. A point that we received a lot of interesting comments about was the fact that the wash blocks that I mentioned earlier were culturally inappropriate, and this was for two reasons. The first reason was that NGOs originally constructed what are called Western seats in the latrine, so these are raised seats, and the refugees were accustomed to and preferred what are called Turkish seats or Arab seats, and they are lower to the ground. And so refugees actually went in and broke the seats and reinstalled them the way that they were accustomed to. The second reason they were culturally inappropriate was that these communal wash blocks required that women walked from their shelters to the shower and back. And in Syrian culture and much of Middle Eastern culture, it's considered inappropriate for anyone except a woman's husband to know that she's bathed. So it's seen as very taboo for someone to be walking around to and from a shower. So women took to actually bathing in their shelters, which created standing water, which can attract insects. The wastewater treatment plant, as I mentioned, is not operational, so that's not serving its purpose. And then there's hygiene promotion in the camp, hygiene kit distribution, waste management services are provided 6 days a week. And then, as I mentioned, scabies, head lice, and hepatitis were reported. So that first research question about identifying stakeholders, there's a list here of all of the different non-governmental organizations and UN agencies working in the camp. So that's one set of stakeholders. The next is donors, which kind of ran the gamut from private sector to public sector, different governments, USAID included. And then Jordanian government ministries, refugees themselves, and host communities were also listed as sets of stakeholders. When we're talking about communication and coordination among these stakeholders, there are a few official mechanisms, and those were these bi-weekly WASH working group meetings for all the NGOs involved in WASH. There are also camp coordination meetings with the NGOs and also the camp police, their SRAD, Syrian Refugee Affairs Directorate. Then there's also a WASH hotline for refugees to call if their latrine is broken or the door is missing or the water's not working. And there are weekly CARE feedback sessions. So CARE will essentially gather all the NGOs and give the refugees a chance to air their complaints, which I went to one of those meetings and it was pretty intense. There was a lot of people yelling, but they actually are seen as a pretty effective feedback mechanism. And then there's also community leaders who kind of arise either through water committees or just kind of naturally have relationships with NGO workers, and refugees will communicate some of their messages that they want to get to NGO workers through those community leaders. One kind of point of contention in coordination among these different stakeholders is that the environmental health standards that people are using differ depending on who you talk to. This table on the left shows the 11 people who mentioned specific standards and which standards they mentioned. And there's SPEAR standards, there's Jordanian standards, there's NGO-specific standards, and then some people would just say standards and not actually say whose standards they were. So this was noted as a point of confusion. And another thing that's worth noting is that stakeholders are all kind of just the way the system is set up. NGOs are competing over limited funding. This is especially true because there's been donor fatigue with regards to the Syrian refugee crisis. It's in its 8th year now. It's not seen as interesting or exciting anymore. So as you can see from this quote at the bottom, all the NGOs are competing for the same funds, and that by nature doesn't allow them to have 100% efficient coordination. That's because of some incentives, and also just it's not going to work out perfectly if you're all competing for the same pot of money. In terms of change over time, the specific responsibilities and roles of stakeholders shifted. For example, World Vision was responsible for constructing the water and sanitation infrastructure, but then it was transferred over to Action Against Hunger. And then World Vision took over the waste management collection from, I believe it was ACTED, which is a French NGO. And then also there was a general improvement in service levels and infrastructure, with the exception of that shortened amount of time that water is available. And there was also a shift towards a longer term camp. It was perceived as having more longevity. It wasn't seen as a temporary situation anymore. At first, they were just responding to an emergency, and then you realize that it's going to be many years. And that shift in thinking was noted by several participants. Also, as I mentioned, donor fatigue and less flexible funding over time are common trends that you see with emergencies, and the NGOs working in the camp were certainly suffering as a result of that. So this was personally my favorite research question of the bunch, and it has to do with the way that different stakeholders perceive sustainability. So there were kind of a few different ways that people would answer this question. They would say what true sustainability would have to look like, and this usually had to do with the municipality taking over control of environmental health services, which makes intuitive sense. One problem is that the municipality is 20 miles from the camp, and you have to cross the desert to get to it. And also there's a pretty clear effort to separate refugees from the host communities by the Jordanian government. They also talked about integrating refugees into host community society and the economies, and having them be able to pay taxes so that the municipal services could be provided to them. These are kind of pie in the sky, but this was one approach, was to define what would have to happen for the camp to have sustainable services. The second set was essentially questioning the possibility of sustainability in the camp at all. And this was largely because, as I mentioned, it's quite isolated, entirely economically and socially isolated, and even geographically. And then refugees are also dependent upon NGOs and foreign aid, so that dependence can create issues with sustainability and ownership. There's also a lack of political will, externally and internally, in Jordan and by the international community to drive sustainable solutions. And there's no income generating opportunities for refugees. So there's no way that they can contribute taxes to the infrastructure and services. And then, so another set of stakeholders talked about incorporating elements of sustainability. They said, even though sustainability as a whole might not be possible, we can incorporate certain aspects of it, whether those are environmental, economic, or social. So an environmental element might be the use of solar power, as I mentioned, or potential future composting. And then economic would be, let's improve the cost benefit situation. Let's sell the recycled materials, and so that the project can kind of fund itself. And then there's also the social component, which involves empowering water committees and building ownership among the refugees. And as this one quote says, this kind of has to do with questioning the possibility at all, but essentially the camp itself is not a sustainable structure. An isolated camp does not lend itself to sustainable solutions. To give a little bit more context about sustainability, the working definition of it is the rational management of natural resources that will not make future generations bear the cost of current overuse. And this diagram that I have here is a pretty common way of perceiving sustainability. It's at this intersection of environment, social, and economic, which actually lines up very nicely with the way that different interviewees responded to these, talking about these elements of sustainability. And UNHCR and the Jordanian government have endeavored to incorporate certain elements, but have not been particularly successful or specific. And then other academics have looked into this issue and have noted that having sustainable WASH infrastructure can lead to benefits for the host community once refugees leave a camp. They outlast the crisis. So to give you a few limitations, there was possible data loss in translation and transcription. Some of the interviews were conducted in Arabic with the translator. There was probably some human error in coding, and data was collected based on participants' memories, so they may not have been perfect. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we could only interview people who were affiliated with World Vision or a partner organization, so this may have skewed the results. Then just to give you some overall conclusions that we found from this. So to remind you, the goal of this was to understand environmental health conditions in a context of protracted displacement and how best to incorporate sustainability in these contexts. And the takeaways are, unsurprisingly, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for sustainable environmental health services in protracted displacement, but we know that isolated camps in particular lead to long-term challenges. So making sure that camps are not geographically and socially and economically isolated is one way to kind of prevent some of these future challenges. And then even when there are isolated camps, you don't have to give up on sustainability. You can incorporate certain environmental, economic, and social elements of it. And then another important note is that displaced populations should be engaged from the get-go. And it's also worth noting that protracted crises are the norm. And so because of that, it's really in everyone's best interest to engage the displaced populations and the host communities as early as possible. And also there's kind of this gap that's perceived between the humanitarian response and the international development communities, and both will have to have their best practices put into solving this challenge. And just to have a couple thank yous, this is my master's committee led by my advisor, Jamie Bartram. Had a lot of help from the Water Institute and from World Vision, from students who helped me screen and code. And then I have my funding listed here. And now I'll take your questions.
Thank you so much. This was a great presentation, Nikki. Anyone have questions or any comments for Nikki? You can unmute and go ahead and ask.
Nikki, this is Eve again. Sorry, I'll go on camera. I was just curious about if there's anyone who is going to take this and do any kind of follow-up study. Are you going to, like, what's going to happen with your data after you're done?
Yeah, that's a great question. So World Vision actually funded part of the work that I did. So they were interested in seeing how they were performing in the camp. So now that I've finished my master's thesis, I'm planning on writing that up and sending it to them in a report format with some recommendations. And then also my goal is to publish it in an academic peer-reviewed journal. So hopefully that will reach kind of a wider audience. I'm going to aim for a journal that serves both practitioners and academics, might drive further research. And I know the Water Institute is very interested in pursuing more research in these kind of contexts. So this can kind of be a baseline for that.
Well, it's really, really great work. Thank you for sharing it.
So Nikki, you may have covered this, but can you put into, this is Kevin, can you put into context how this work might be even more important given climate change and the other things that are happening to continue to displace people internally and across borders?
Yeah, for sure. So almost all of the literature that we looked into in that systematic literature review I mentioned had to do with populations who had to flee violence or conflict or political instability. And there were a few that had to do with natural disasters, and a couple that had to do with climate refugees, but that is predicted to be a larger proportion of displaced persons in the future. So if you look at, for example, Mozambique and Malawi right now, there was a cyclone that was likely driven by the impacts of climate change. Those kind of storms are going to become more frequent, and they're going to be more intense and more unpredictable. And it's one thing, it's already pretty bad in Malawi and Mozambique, and people will have to move because of it. But when it hits somewhere like the Maldives, that is going to entirely submerge the island. And then you have to relocate an entire island's worth of people somewhere. So islands are a particular concern for climate change, but also just any coastal community, even non-coastal communities, because the droughts that we're seeing in Eastern and Southern Africa are driving people to move. It's just places that already are prone to conflict are likely to have more conflict as a result of some of these things that put pressure on their infrastructure and institutions. So basically, it's going to mess everything up even more than it already is. And we should expect to see a lot more climate change driven displacement in the future and prepare for it.
Always good to hear.
Yes,
Nikki, this is Gene Perry. I have a question. Considering the recent turmoil in the United States with our version of refugees
right
at the southern border, what type of national impact do these camps have in the places that you've talked about?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So camps often seem like the best thing to do in the short term, because you're essentially putting all the same people in one place. You can easily monitor them, easily track them, easily provide for them in that place. But then over time, it becomes a drain on resources for everyone involved, because all of the NGOs funding dries up. The government can't necessarily support the camp on its own. So it actually is a lot more cost effective to integrate the refugees from the get-go. And that clearly in the US, the political environment right now, that's less likely. But we know empirically and anecdotally, and everything points to we should really be integrating these displaced populations rather than sticking them all in a camp, because that ends up being just a larger problem in the future. And most of the time, the future, it's not going to go away within 6 months or 2 years. It's often going to last way longer than that. So we have to shift our thinking from, okay, this is an emergency, we have to put everyone in the same place, to they're going to be here for up to a decade, if not more.
Is there, from your study or your reviews, is there some sort of a look at an extended, in other words, a population that's been in a relocated situation for an extended period of time? What happens to those people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The best example is actually Palestinian refugees, many of whom are in Jordan. So most of them were displaced in 1947, 48. Another wave was displaced in 1967. And basically the camps that were established back then are now just cities. They're neighborhoods, they're cities. They still have some outside support from UNRWA, but they aren't camps anymore. They're really just urban areas that are part of the country. And that it's complicated because you don't want to necessarily encourage conflicts it's very politically complicated. Essentially, all of the Palestinian refugees don't want to believe that they're never going back. And you also don't want to ever put a government where there are people fleeing in a position like, oh, they can just resettle elsewhere forever. Someone else can take care of them. That's not a great incentive. So it's really difficult because arguably one of the more successful examples is also just so politically complex. So I think if you can do your best to prioritize human rights as early as possible, I think that helps. But also trying to find a solution in the country that the people came from. That's another important component of it.
Thank you. I knew it was a complex question, but you mentioned that huge number of people who are refugees. I think you said 60 million.
68. Yep.
That's a whole country.
It is. Absolutely.
Nikki, I have another question. This is Eve. I can cede my question time if somebody else has a question, though, because I've already asked you. I was curious about whether there, in your qualitative work, were there any big surprises that you weren't like? I know the toilets were interesting. I was intrigued by the fact that the toilets weren't even culturally sensitive or appropriate, but were there other things that you weren't expecting to hear that surprised you, or did you have a pretty good handle on what you were walking into?
That's a really good question because, you always go in with, I didn't have an official hypothesis, but you always kind of go in with expectations. I don't think I realized quite how, trying to think of the right word for this, how strict the kind of social situation was in the camp. So a lot of the reading I've done on especially refugees living in the Middle East is that informal actors will kind of come in and fill the role that government doesn't. So you'll see informal water vendors, or you'll see people connecting illegally to pipelines and things like that. Or you'll have just neighborhood committees that'll kind of spontaneously form. That isn't an option in Azraq. And I was really expecting to see, there were water committees, but they were so tightly controlled by the NGOs that they weren't really organically developing. And the security environment in the camp was something I was really surprised to hear about. And the fact that that just wasn't really a possibility because of it, the kind of organic development of these informal institutions. And then one other thing was, so I mentioned there's 4 villages, and village 5 is this high security village where essentially when you arrive, you are plopped into that village and you stay there for sometimes years while they screen you for connections to ISIS. And there's been a lot of outcry about it because people are stuck there for years and are not able to access the same resources inside the camp and are separated from their family members who are across the fence and things like that. So that was something that I didn't know about going in and was really surprised to hear about.
Wow. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
Well, I thank you, Nikki. Again, we're going to wrap up.
Hey, Rhonda, can I ask? Rhonda, I'm sorry. Go
ahead.
Can I ask one more question? Or Rhonda, are you there?
Uh-oh.
You guys hear me? Yeah. Can I ask one more question?
That's fine. Go ahead, Kevin. Thanks.
Okay, I'm sorry. Nikki, I was wondering.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Can you hit maybe 2 or 3 highlights in your preparation for this? I mean, you studied peace, war, and defense. That seems to be relevant. And also, obviously work at the Water Institute. But what would you say are maybe 2 or 3 of the key things that happened in your preparation to allow you to see what you saw and to pull those things out on this trip?
So you mentioned the peace, war, and defense thing. I did not come to public health from a typical kind of STEM background that a lot of people come to it from. Especially my department is very engineering heavy, very environmental science, like hardcore science heavy. And I think that my social science background has actually been an advantage because I've been able to look at angles that people didn't necessarily think about or don't think about in the lab context. which a lot of people do really awesome work doing water quality and everything, but they spend a lot of time in the lab and sometimes neglect kind of the larger implications and social aspects, which a lot of people think of kind of qualitative research as kind of wishy-washy, but I honestly find it to be fascinating because you actually get answers about like why things are happening and how they're happening. So that was part of it. And the second one was with the Water Institute, I've been very fortunate to have had field research experience in the past. I went to Zambia with them when I was just a junior in college. They somehow trusted me to go there and do a bunch of qualitative research on rural communities and water systems there. And then they sent me to Malawi to look at all these healthcare facilities and their environmental health. So I had a lot of experience going into this, particularly with qualitative research and some quantitative, that I think prepared me for a lot of the curveballs that you get thrown in the field. And those are things that you really only get better by going and trying it out. You get thrown into the fire, and that's the only way that you learn how to deal with them. I'd say those are probably the top two things.
Thank you, and Rhonda, thank you for letting me get that last question in. Appreciate it.
Sure. No, thank you again, Nikki. Great work that you're doing, and I look forward to you when you graduate. What is next?
Yeah.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to share. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I said I just don't know what's next, so I'm figuring that out.
I know 6 weeks it feels like it's far away, but it'll be here before you know it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Nikki, with that, we have a little virtual thank you to share with you. I hope that you all can see my screen. And it's just, again, to say thanks for the certificate of appreciation to Nikki, to say thank you for your valuable insight and inspiration as our guest speaker. It's been very, very good to have you and to learn about your experiences and what you actually were able to give, as well as take away from your field work. With that, we're going to end our meeting with our 4-way test, and I'd like to see if there are any volunteers. Okay, no volunteers tonight. Well, I will be happy to lead. The 4-way test are the things we think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And with that, I say good night, and I will ask to stop the recording.